Just come up with every other variation on it.
I said without anything else.
Yeah, without. Anyway, so yes, we're going to talk today a little bit about where we're at with a research project that we've been working on over the past couple of years. As Michael mentioned, this began with some grand ambitions, actually. We wanted, with our national ethics project partners who are at the Stanford Ethics Center, at DePaul University, down at the University of South Florida, around the country, we wanted to determine where and how ethics was taught around the country. So we dove right in. We're like, we're going to figure this out. How do people teach ethics these days? And then very quickly we realized that was a very difficult task to just assume one would know how to do. So we had to dial it back, and what we ended up doing is some methodological innovations, and starting with our part of the project, focusing a little more specifically on ethics instruction at Harvard. We figured, well, let's see if we can figure out where and how ethics is taught at Harvard, and then maybe we might have a shot at getting a better sense of what's happening on other campuses too. Now, our Stanford partners were really focusing on student learning and student needs, thinking about what are we not, if we're looking backwards with instructional expertise, we may not know what we're not doing that we need to be doing. So they're really taking a forward-looking view and trying to understand student needs. And at South Florida, they were looking at the institutional perspectives and trying to understand, just sort of broadly by scraping websites, where ethics learning is happening in pockets around campuses. So our project is really focused on ethics instruction, and we tried to do a more targeted view of what's happening in classrooms. And the first thing we needed to do was to, what happened? Okay, was to determine which classrooms to look at. So that was our first challenge. And in our methodological overview here, I'm going to focus on part one, which is our custom search algorithm, which is a really fancy term for a simple search tool that was not simple to develop, but that we thought would help us get part of the way there for at least trying to figure out how to identify what is an ethics course, or at least what are the courses we would want to study where we think important ethics concepts and themes are being addressed in classrooms. I'm going to then hand it over to David, my colleague, who's going to talk about section 2 and 3, looking at the faculty learning survey, a learning theory survey, and the student response survey. So curriculum mapping, this is where we started because we felt like we needed to rethink the ethics course. What we thought of right away was that if we just began with searching for courses where you saw the word ethics or morals alone in the title, we may not actually capture all the places where ethics learning is happening. So we decided we've got to come up with a new way to identify the ethics course. And that's how we engaged in this course search algorithm process, and also how we engaged in just trying to determine a little bit more broadly and inclusively what ethics instruction on campus might look like. So some of the benefits we thought was trying to get this landscape view of where and how ethics how the campus offers students ethics instruction, that the curriculum mapping approach could help us with that. We thought maybe at the end of the day it might also help us come up with a tool that could be used for purposeful curriculum design. So we make the joke, well, maybe we're teaching too many Rawls courses, and we just don't know that. In fact, we're happy to say that that didn't come up as much as we predicted. We also thought that if we could identify the courses where this was going on, and we really truly had no idea from where we sat at the start of this, then that would be our first step to engaging with instructors around the campus, and that was important to us. And again, finally, bringing in all of these courses that might otherwise be overlooked, and I think some of the data I'm going to show you will indicate how exactly that worked. Very briefly, just so you have a sense of our method here, what we did was we started with just a handful of key terms that we used to search the course catalog, and we saw what came up from that. And actually, we felt like we were getting false positives, and we knew we were missing things too. So we broadened it out after doing some coding, weeding out some words, seeing in the descriptions other words that we thought were good words to trigger. things that we were looking for. So we refined our terms. We started weighting them, which meant that we were giving different weights to different types of terms. And then we searched again. And at the end of the day, we finally thought, well, we want to make sure we're not missing really important and obvious things just because they weren't in our search pool. So we went through the Cambridge Dictionary of Philosophy and the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, a couple of levels down and deep, and we added in all of the sort of distinctive terms we found there that seemed relevant as well. And in this process, then we created a rather large and comprehensive algorithm that searched for 305 different terms as we were scanning in this weighted fashion. So we certainly didn't want to exclude courses that explicitly said they were talking about ethics or morals. So anything that had that in the title or in the description, we immediately caught and said that's what we want to work with. But in our second orbit, we weighted those terms half a point. So essentially the idea was you'd have to have two of those terms working together if the course was going to get pulled. When we got to the third orbit, you'd have to have, these are words that were a little more on the periphery, so you'd have to have 4 of them, say, if it was going to get pulled. And then we ran our search over the last 3 semesters. And here's where I want to say that we were pretty pleased with this approach as opposed to just searching ethic and moral. If you look at what we found in the fall, spring, and then the fall again from 2017 through 18, you'll see that out of the discrete course offerings at Harvard, just over 3,000 each semester. Each time, consistently, our tool pulled just over 500. And the core terms, meaning ethic and moral, pulled under half of all the courses we ended up looking at. So our orbital terms really expanded the number of courses that we included in our study. Does that make sense? Okay. And just to give you a sense here of where we found the courses across the campus, you can see that FAS and the college was accounted for the majority, and then down the line, the law school, Division of Continuing Ed, the Graduate School of Education, Kennedy School, HMS, I think that's supposed to say. That's the medical school, the Divinity School, Graduate School of Design. I'm going all the way down just because every time I do this presentation, I have to make a joke about business ethics and HBS. No, the reason why it only says 1% is because at the business school, they have a block, a paywall on their course description. So it was actually really hard for us to even get access to the course description. So we need to do a better job still of including the information on that. But we did work with the main leadership and corporate accountability course and a few other courses we did find. So we were able to get some of their data. This approach, I should say, too, you can see in a way why it would favor FAS a little bit just in terms of the type and the variety of courses offered. If you're a professional school where you have one course in a lot of different sections, then that description is going to be the same. So we try not to put too much stock in terms of that weighting of where it came from, but it will show you just a little bit about the range and the spread for where the courses were that we identified on campus. So I wanted to throw this up here just to give you a sense of all the kinds of terms that we were looking for, and to let you know that even though we had 305 terms in our search tool, only 169 did any work for us. So these represent ones that popped up, I think, at least 4 or 5 times. So words like ethics and rights that you would expect are still up there, but some words that maybe you wouldn't think of out the chute when you're running a search for an ethics course. Negligence, realism, scandal, fraud, empathy, Judith Butler, welfare, fairness, evil, terror. So we went into negative valences, positive valences, and we really broadened this out. Okay, and then just to give you a sense of the sort of most common terminology that appeared in the courses we found on the campus, we've broken this out by the schools where we had the highest number of course hits, FAS, the law school, and the Graduate School of Education. What you see here in bold are the terms that are just sort of, there's some overlap across the schools. And then you can see some other terms that were very commonly coming up in the course descriptions. Just gives you a little bit of a flavor. We almost want to do this in a quiz style because it would be interesting to see if you could guess which school the terms emerged from. But with the law school, for instance, words like terror, respect, corrupt, dilemma, wrong, obligation, leadership come up. The grad school of education, again, leadership at the top, ethics, justice, dilemma, civic, moral, violence, obligation, bullying, rights. And FAS, I just want to call your attention to Plato, Aristotle, Kant, Marx, and truth, because those are not terms that were coming up in our professional school context, which is, I think, very interesting and important, which will come up a little bit later in David's presentation, too. Okay, so then in the third orbit, just again, I won't go through everything here, but you can just again see some of the other words and the flavors that you get from the different schools. Law school with abuse, controversial, security, conflict. And there is some interesting, I would say, resonance across the domains in terms of the words that are coming up consistently, no matter the school. And then again, some variation too. So. We also wanted to give you just a sense of the kinds of courses that our search tool was pulling. That, again, when David talks to you a little bit more about his engagement with instructors through the faculty learning survey after, you'll get a sense of what types of courses we were reaching out to and what that looked like. So a sample here, most points. So these courses on my right are the ones that earned over 4 points. So lots of different hits. The ones over on my left would be the ones that were that only 1 point. So they just sort of made it into the cut. So justice and reconciliation after mass violence, leadership and environmental conflicts, transformative justice from classroom to cell block to community. Those are a lot of points. Fewest points, introduction to social studies, right? Maybe you wouldn't pick that off the top of your head, maybe you would. Family medicine, advanced primary care, sexual and reproductive health, a global perspective. And this will show you how exactly the tool worked. So earning a lot of points here, justice and reconciliation after mass violence, you can see in the yellow, those are all the highlighted terms that were second orbit words we were looking at, and then blue is the third orbit terms. So you can see a lot of different terms coming up in different ways, and that's how it earned so many points. And then on this course, just 2 second orbit terms, the word rights and the word abortion. So that was enough for us to pull it. Of course, we would not have looked at had we not come up with this sort of method and approach. Okay. Again, as I said at the beginning, the curriculum mapping process allowed us to identify instructors and to find instructors we wouldn't have otherwise thought about engaging with. And this gives you just a sense of who those, or not who, but how many instructors we were trying to reach out to and how well it went. So we had 427 individual instructors of record that we recruited in the fall of 2017, 389 in the spring, and 310 in fall 2018. The only reason the number drops, even though the course number stays the same, is because as the semesters went on, we had already engaged with some of them, and we were not repeating by going back and asking the same person to work with us twice in most instances. So we had a rather shockingly high, from our perspective, response rate. So thank you so much to all the people from the Harvard community who actually responded to us with 28% in the first semester, 25, and then 25 again. This was pretty good, given that I think Danielle's prediction was 0 at the start of the studies. Harvard professors are too busy for this. But no, everybody was very generous, and that helped us out a lot. So again, instructor affiliations pretty closely mirrors what we found in terms of the course affiliations, but some people were listing themselves. So you can just get a sense of where instructors, where the instructors were that we reached out to. 38% from FAS, and then again down the line, so 13% and below along the way. This will be the last slide that I talked about before I hand it over to David. I just wanted to say that I think this is a really interesting addition to our survey, because what we realized was we wanted to get a sense from instructors as we asked them to engage with us, the degree to which they were surprised that we included them in this study. We were getting some reactions from people when we sent them our survey asking them to participate, and sometimes people were upset about the fact that we were trying to assess ethics education. You can't do that. It seemed like a violation of the work that we were trying to do as humanities scholars. Some people say, I have no idea why'd you send this to me, right? And that could be a simple false positive, but in other instances it was just people were pleasantly surprised. Yes, I do teach things that matter. I do see the importance of my work in ethics, and I'm surprised that you actually noticed that or would have included me. So if you look at what's going on here in this slide, what you'll see is the distribution across surprise, which is in the red, is a little bit more flat, ranging from if somebody strongly disagreed that they were surprised, right? That means they're not surprised at all that we included them. But we did have some agreeing, strongly agreeing, or somewhat agreeing, right, that they're surprised. And yet, if you look at the blue lines, what you see, this being, I believe my course belongs in the study, right? Most of the people are skewing toward agreeing, somewhat agreeing, and strongly agreeing that they should be included. So our key takeaway from this was that we were looking to be more inclusive in what we were identifying. We did do a lot of work to weed out what we thought were going to be false positives. You can see from the range of terms we used, right? We were specifically excluding terms that kind of caught us the junk fish, right? And at the end of the day, although this doesn't, argue in any way that we caught everything out there or anything like that, but what it did tell us was that it's a pretty good measure that we were inclusive. We got to people who we would not have otherwise got to, and they were agreeing with us that they should be included in the study. So I will hand this off to David now so he can talk to you a little bit more about the learning theory survey itself and also the student responses that we received. And I just want to add that I was excited when Roni was talking earlier today about learning theories and about what are our goals as ethics instructors, because again, at the very beginning of this, that's what we thought. We want to reach out with this idea of emergent trends and really understand from the people who do this work, what are your goals that you bring into your classroom? And we wanted to do that in a way where we were respectful of the fact that, people teaching at all these different schools on campus are going to have different goals. So how are we going to understand what that looks like and then figure out how to assess that with some sort of nuance? So that was really guiding us in our approach to what we were doing with this study next. So I'll hand it over to David. Thanks.
Okay, so picking up where Jess left off, again, so now we're at a position where we have all of these courses that we think are addressing ethics, but we still don't know what ethics is or how ethics is being taught. So that brings us to point 2 and 3. And before I dig into the survey that we created to elicit the learning theories of instructors, I want to give a little bit of theoretical background into sort of what motivated the construction of the survey. So 3 principles that we bring to this work are, first of all, that teaching is a craft practice, or is to some degree a craft practice, that education, particularly in the humanities, operates under a principle of economy, and that education contributes to human development, that we have to understand education in terms of how it contributes to developing people. So first, this idea of craft practice. The idea here is that there's a lot that goes into teaching that is not learned in a very explicit way. So often teachers learn from mentors, so they model, they rely on modeling. And what this sometimes means is that teachers cannot always explain, or I shouldn't say they can't, they don't always explain why they are doing what they're doing. And sometimes they don't even make it explicit to themselves. This doesn't mean that what they are doing lacks a logic. It just means that that logic has not been systematically made explicit. So one of the things that we try to do in our work is to facilitate the identification of the logic underlying the craft of teaching and make it easier to talk about it, recognizing that we'll lose some of the nuance of that craft as we go about this process, but to at least give us a starting point. Another thing that we assume that builds on the idea of craft practice is the idea that, particularly in the humanities, education operates under a principle of economy. The idea here is that there's probably more than one thing going on in a classroom at one time, again, especially in the humanities. So even in a seminar, there might be one student or set of students for whom it's really about learning communication skills. Maybe they haven't had a lot of opportunities for class discussions. There might be other students who are directed to really develop their analytical skills, all in the same classroom. And a master teacher might be able to guide students along these different learning pathways simultaneously, even. What this means is that we can't define education in terms of a single goal or a single mechanism, that we have to be attentive to the fact there's probably more than one thing going on, and that at best we're probably looking at sort of dominant flavors or general trends when we're describing a class. The other thing that we bring to this work is trying to think about education in terms of human development. So even if we're thinking about something like a vocationally oriented course, that this course is not just about making somebody into a better attorney, for example, but that there is something about being a better attorney that contributes to that individual's flourishing as a human being. And so here, this is work that's really developed by Professor Allen, building on Hannah Arendt's work on human flourishing. The idea here is that we can think very broadly about education as making us better community members, and the community has a stake in that, right? So that's one reason the community might be concerned about education. That education and can make us better workers, better able to sustain ourselves through meaningful work. And also that education can help us become just better individuals in our private lives, where perhaps we're the only ones who should be able to judge whether or not we're developing successfully in that domain, but nonetheless we should be given sort of the skills and capacities to develop meaningful, close relationships and have a real sense of purpose as individuals. So we like to think of education as contributing to all three of these domains, but we also should be sensitive to the fact that a course that's really focused on, say, civic development might not have a lot that is clearly going to help the student, make money, right? So some students might ask, how is this going to help me get a job? Well, sometimes that is the primary goal of education, but not always, and we think it's important to see all of these as equal justifications. So with all of that in mind, we're trying to keep these principles in mind as we sort of march through this series of what we thought were fairly straightforward questions. So first, how are instructors teaching ethics? What does success look like to them in their teaching? How are students learning ethics? What do they think they're learning? And are these two stories of ethics education the same? And where do they diverge? What are faculty telling us? What are students telling us about their experiences? And what can we learn from looking at the convergence of those? And finally, we want to understand a little bit more about how the ways in which these questions are answered by different stakeholders differ depending on whether or not people are, for example, interested in vocational development or civic development. So my background is in survey research, so the answer is always a survey. And so we worked on developing surveys to collect data fairly systematically from people, starting with instructors. And the student survey is basically just a reproduction of the instructor survey, so I'm going to focus my attention on describing the instructor survey. Both surveys have the same basic structure. We are trying to establish sort of the logic of teaching. So we're trying to build a loose causal model of starting very concretely what resources are deployed in the classroom, what mechanisms are those resources supposed to activate? So what sorts of thinking is going on in the heads of students, I should say the minds of students in the classroom. And then finally, when students leave the classroom, what will all of this activity have made them better able to do? So starting very concretely, this is just a screenshot of the survey itself, which was online, so it might be hard to read. The important thing is there are a lot of response options, including blank response options. So here we wanted to know sort of what materials are being used. Are these empirical readings? Is it social media posts? And we tried to have as many options as we could think of, and then we also encouraged instructors to use the blanks to tell us things that we hadn't thought of. And then over the 3 semesters we've run this study, every time when we saw a few things come up in those blanks, basically more than once, it made it to the full list. So the idea here is to cast as wide of a net as possible, let people describe their teaching in the language that is most familiar to them. And we do the same thing for activities, so this can range from field work to lectures. And we asked instructors to choose the 3 items that they thought were most important to their class. We tried a number of different methods to get people to sort of rank them, and we decided that just choosing the top 3 is probably the best approach to get at least some sense of where the priorities are. After instructors chose up to 3 from this first page, they were shown a second page that was, okay, now you can select anything else that's important to your teaching. And some people selected everything. Some people actually only selected one thing. So there was a lot of variation in how much people wanted to say about their teaching. So after we got to resources, then we moved a little bit more abstract to sort of what types of thinking are being engaged or cultivated by the instructor. This was a shorter list. Interestingly, we didn't get a lot of additions to this list, probably because these are a little bit hard to pin down, so they're all a little bit vague and inclusive. But this could be everything from engaging with different perspectives to articulating arguments, such as in like a debate or something like that in class. And finally, we get to what do students leave able to do better? And this is a very long list as well. And despite its length, there are 21 response options here. Every single one of these was selected at least once by instructors. So there's, it's not like everybody just went for one thing. Though there was, as we'll see soon, there was convergence around a number of goals. And then at the very end of the survey, instructors were asked to think broadly about the course. What domain of human development do you see this as most relevant to? Not everybody provided a response here, and we'll see an example of that. But many instructors did, and it sort of helps us see perhaps some trends across divisions of the university. But this was to sort of allow us to answer that final question of how do the goals and methods of instructors vary depending on whether or not they're aiming for one of these domains of human development. The idea is we'll pull all these responses together. We'll build a nice causal model here that will tell us what is being achieved or what people think they're achieving and how they think they're doing it. One thing I should also note is that there were actually other sections to the survey that I'm not going to talk about here today. So we asked questions about classroom climate. We asked questions about what sorts of topics instructors avoid, including controversial topics, which interestingly, very few instructors were admitted to that or saw it as something they really tried to avoid. But so there are other elements here, but for the sake of brevity, let's go through the main areas. So, not only am I not going to talk about all of the survey, I'm also not going to talk about all of our survey data. And the reason for that is that we think we've improved the survey substantially since fall 2017. And so I'm only going to talk about the data we collected this last fall, fall 2018, because we think it's our best data. And then I'm also going to briefly talk about some follow-up research that we did piloting our student survey to understand how students in some of these 79 courses solved their learning experience, what they thought they learned and how. So I'm going to sort of let you take a breath, and then I'm going to walk you through this diagram where I've tried to include all of the information. So the first thing that happened with the data is it looked at which domain of human development instructors identified as most important to their teaching. And so then I grouped the courses according to that domain of human development. So there was a group of courses that the instructor labeled as primarily existential, a group of courses that were vocational, and a group that were civic. Then for each of those groups, for each survey section, I looked very simply at which were the items that were most frequently selected as most important to instructors' teaching. So it's just counting up the numbers in each of these groups. And then I just looked at the three most common. In some cases, whether or not somebody was pursuing civic, vocational, or existential development didn't matter at all. They all chose the same things, and so those are in this sort of salmon-y color. In other cases, they were shared across domains. So for example, instructors who identify their courses civically oriented or vocationally oriented, personal experiences and case studies came up in the top 3 for both of those groups. So that's why they get a yellow and sort of turquoisey shaded box. The idea is that what we can see here is that the civic and vocational courses seem to have a little bit more in common with each other than with the existential courses. But it's hard to look at the trajectory of these courses and make a strong argument, I think, that one of these categories is not relevant to ethics education, or that one of these outcomes dominates all of the others. Instead, what it suggests, I think, is that there are a lot of different legitimate goals in ethics education that are being pursued, and it's unlikely that a single course is going to address every single one of these. More broadly, this gives us sort of a general picture of what are the types of ethics education a student might encounter here on campus. So after we asked instructors, we also asked students to complete essentially the same survey, just from their perspective as learners. So instructors were asked at the beginning of class, what's going to happen in your class? At the end of the class, students were asked, what do you think happened to you in this class? What do you think we did? And I should note that, or remind you that the student responses come from 29 courses. And not all of those courses had a large response rate. So the limitations of our instructor data, only coming from 79 courses, are compounded when we look at these data. So this is really meant more to demonstrate sort of how we can analyze these data and what sort of pictures we can draw with the data. So with those limitations in mind, what we can see here is that, again, existential development seems to sort of be popping out as separate, particularly from the civic and vocationally oriented courses. But there's also a remarkable convergence around a few things. Personal experiences. Students, at least, are saying these are really important. So this is when students are able to talk about the course material in relation to themselves. This could also reflect a number of biases that people have. But it could also tell us something really important about learning. Then what we also see is that class discussions are really important, and engaging with different perspectives is really important. Being able to deal with multiple stakeholders is really important, regardless of the domain of human development. And this is students telling us this. And this is something that matters a lot from the perspective of trying to think about assessment, because right now we don't have good ways of assessing whether or not people are good at engaging with different perspectives. And we don't have sort of ways to make sure that we are equipping instructors to help people engage with different perspectives effectively. Or I should say, we probably do have those resources, we aren't identifying them well, because clearly this is happening on campus. So it's something about this is something that we could really sort of try to develop and make explicit. How is it that we're able to do this as educators? One thing that we really want to do with this work is to produce information that's valuable to stakeholders at different levels. So what we've talked about so far is looking on an aggregate level, trying to look, what is the university doing around ethics education? And also to bring to the surface potentially interesting theoretical research questions, right? Because these are theories of human development that are coming from teacher practice. And so those become interesting research questions for people interested in how people learn, right? Because we can go and then test these hypotheses. But from an individual instructor's perspective, they might not be as concerned with the aggregate view than what did my students say about my class? And this is where we've been experimenting with ways of reporting back these data to instructors. So here's an example of a chart that that's based on the charts I showed before, but this time is showing the instructor's responses along with the students' responses. So this was a graduate level course. The instructor did not identify any domain of human development, so this was a case where the instructor remained agnostic on that. The students had no problem saying this is vocationally oriented. And when we start to look at the path that students are taking, it's not surprising alongside the aggregate data that suggests that case studies, empirical readings tend to be more associated with civic or vocational development. But what's most important here is there's nearly perfect alignment of student and instructor views of this course, with some minor exceptions in materials and activities. So the philosophical and theoretical readings, the students didn't seem to pick up on as being all that important. One thing that's really interesting is the students identified guest speakers, so a really important activity. And this is just striking because this didn't come up a lot. This is one of the more rarely selected options. And perhaps because it's hard to do well to integrate guest speakers. So this is a case where the instructor, it seems like, sort of nailed this. And so other instructors might be able to say, so how did you do that? What was your strategy for inviting people? How did you introduce them? Things like that. I'm going to give you an example now of a course where there wasn't quite so much alignment. So this is a case where the instructor saw their course as vocationally oriented. It's also from a graduate school. The students saw it as more existential. So they're really sort of reflecting on their own values versus getting in the nitty-gritty of sort of policy implications. This is another case where students sort of identify something that the instructor didn't in the activities. So student presentations, students are saying this was really valuable for my learning. And that might be really valuable for instructors who are thinking, how do we do this effectively? But you also see that the student and instructor impressions of the course really start to diverge as you get towards the cultivation goals and the achievement goals, which suggests that maybe the instructor and the students are not experiencing the course in exactly the same way. This doesn't mean that the instructor is teaching a bad class. These are all laudable outcomes that students might be achieving. It might be a simple matter of the instructor better communicating about what students are going to learn in the course. But it might also mean that the instructor does need to sort of emphasize different aspects of their course more than others in the future. The basic idea here is that the results, these analyses should not be interpreted as sort of success or failure. They're helping people reflect on, this is what I think I'm doing, this is what my students think I'm doing, and we'll leave it up to instructors to sort of suss out the valence of the affect that they experience. Let's see this. So what we've tried to do here is demonstrate really methods. And the actual conclusions we can draw from this about ethics education are of course limited by the fact that we've only done this study here on this campus, that we did not have full participation of all faculty, and that certainly we didn't get a lot of participation from students to make broad claims about the experiences of students on campus, given the data we have now. We are working, as Jess mentioned, to expand our reach and bring on board other institutions to use similar methods to try to look beyond Harvard. But we also think it would be possible to develop these methods on a departmental level or on a school level to get sort of a full view of what's happening around ethics education. Also, these are all self-reports. We don't think that there are sort of inbuilt incentives to lie on these. Again, we're not asking instructors, how well do you teach ethics? Or or students, how much do you like this instructor? We really are trying to give response options that are less about evaluating quality and more about describing what happened. But we do think that it is important to have performance-based assessments for accountability. But one thing that we have learned is that assessments are not going to be able to assess one single thing called ethics, that depending on the course, the goals might be quite different. And so we have to be very careful when we do assessment of not running with a single definition that means that we end up either failing to account for actual learning that's going on, or we perhaps overestimate how much ethics education is happening because we've reduced it to something that's really easy to achieve. So really what we've done is we've expanded the challenges that we face in assessment by, we think, better describing the complexity of ethics education here on campus, and we assume elsewhere. So we do think we can get some approach to describing the landscape of ethics education, but really we see this as a first step in developing methods that we do think still need additional work. With that huge caveat in mind, I think that Jess and I are ready to turn things over to you for questions.
Thank you so much. It's incredibly interesting. Two questions. One, just a question of clarification. I think your questions were descriptive and not prescriptive, but a couple of times the way you described some of the responses, it seemed like it was edging a bit into prescriptive, or at least how well did this thing happen, or how much should this happen versus how much did this happen. So just maybe a little bit more from anyone about where you see this work resting in the descriptive to prescriptive continuum. And then I was struck that in, I think it was the first class profile, that the instructor saw it as an existential course, and yet there was, let's see, using personal experience wasn't, let's see, it might have been the second one. Was that the first one that you showed?
No, this was the first one where the
Yeah.
instructor didn't say anything about the domain.
Mm-hmm. There was one where the instructor saw it as existential, but personal experience wasn't prominently used, and I just thought that was a I was curious about.
I think it was the first of this format of slides where you showed a lot of courses at once.
Yeah.
Here.
Yes.
Yes. Yes. So
Right,
this is
yeah.
these are aggregate data,
Right.
actually.
I see. Okay.
But yes, you're right that personal experiences was not one of the key things for the existentially oriented courses.
Right. That.
That's
Yes.
partially because it got pushed aside by just real dominance of philosophical readings and art and literature.
Yeah. Yeah. So that just seemed surprising to me.
Oh, and I do want to, on that first
First
point,
question.
so part of that was probably just sloppy language on my part, because we really don't think that at this point we're equipped, I'm certainly not equipped to say, to look at one of these sort of logic models and say, well, that's not going to work. Or sort of say, well, that's a bad goal to have, or a bad method for reaching that goal. So insofar as we could say on an individual level course, say, okay, maybe the instructor's not doing such a good job of teaching students to take personal responsibility. I think there could be some evaluative interpretation of just like, this doesn't seem to be happening, in the same way that the instructor thinks it's happening. But in any case, any sort of evaluation would be ideally on the instructor's own terms. So if an instructor is not trying to teach personal responsibility, we shouldn't be assessing students based on whether or not they're increasing in that capacity. Jess, do you want to add to that? It's a really important question.
Yeah, right.
back to the aggregate for instructors too, because I'm gonna make a point about that here. But I think, I definitely think that at this point, we're seeing it as primarily descriptive, and that's in part because what we're trying to do is to go back to his theoretical foundations and say, if we actually trust that instructors are expert and that this is a craft practice, it's difficult to assess the humanities, it's difficult to understand all the complexity of learning that's happening, that it forced us to actually slow down on how do we assess this out the chute, and to start with, what do people do? And what are they trying to do? And then let's assess them on those terms, not on some abstract idea of a few people decided that this was the goal of ethics education. And so if you look here, you know, our hope with the descriptive approach first, and this idea of the emergent trends, is, you know, eventually if we got thousands and thousands of instructors around the country to respond, then we'll be interested to see what happens in the quote all domain category. Right now in the cultivation goals, you'll see engaging with different perspectives and reflecting on one's own thinking and values, right? So those are two things that, regardless of if they had selected civic, vocational, or existential, those are cultivation goals that instructors are sharing. We expect to see, hopefully across the country, more and more things emerge in an all domain kind of way that might give us the first start of, well, these would be the highest, you know, kind of value areas to develop new assessment instruments for. If we then want to actually look at what are students achieving in these areas, and that those would be useful tools to people, to the widest range of instructors. But essentially, the idea would be, you know, we would also have assessment instruments that speak back to whether or not somebody is interested in goals that align with the civic or the vocational or the existential domain. Because truly, when you think about it, we don't want to be, you know, you see the division already with courses that are pursuing existential development. We don't want to be assessing, you know, how well they're going to get a job, or if, you know, did they develop the ethical skills and capacities toward those kinds of more targeted goals. So I think that's our idea. We wanted to do something, and we actually started out developing new assessment instruments to actually do something that was more performance-based. And we sort of got on the right track because with the students also saying that they want to evaluate different perspectives, engage with different perspectives, and the whole idea of looking at the perspectives of multiple stakeholders, we started out developing some instruments in that space, but then we actually put the brakes on and said, you know what, we actually need a lot more data here before we engage in looking at how we're going to develop new instruments. And so that's where we're at. So it's taken 3 semesters to just to even get our tools to the point where they're collecting data that's useful to us. And then with the National Ethics Project, the idea would be to expand this out now. So generalizability is a big question for us. Even with our course algorithm I was explaining to you, you know, that could be somewhat limited going to other campuses and seeing what it pulls in. So we're going to look at how we could generalize. But there's a lot of interest in using these tools. There's a lot of willingness on the part of other universities. They too, you know, want to know, and I think there's a lot of support for the idea of approaching this from an emergent approach rather than from a kind of a top-down approach.
Thank you.
I think you mentioned that.
Can you switch that off?
I think you. Oh, is this on?
Yeah.
I think you mentioned that there were a few different iterations of the survey, and so you're sort of focusing on the data from the most recent one. I'm just curious, like what were some of the changes that you made? I know you talked about adding the text entry back to the sort of multiple choice select question, but yeah, were there other changes that you made in order to sort of get the data you hoped to?
Right. So that the main change came in trying to find a way to figure out what was most important to instructors. So in the first iteration of the survey, we asked people to select all of the things that were relevant to their teaching and then rank them, which, you know, a little bit of perspective taking would have taken us a long way there. It's really annoying to do that, especially when you get down to like item 12. And you're like, is it really more important than, I don't know, 11? And so it didn't work very well. And then we moved to a different method where we asked people to start by just choosing all of those that were relevant and then rank within those still didn't work very well because some people just chose and didn't do it. So a lot of it was really just sort of mechanics of figuring out like what is a format that will make things less annoying for people filling out the surveys, but will still get us meaningful data. And so what we ended up with was, let's just ask them about the 3 most important, and then if they have anything else to say, they can say it then, but first let's just get that. And there's still concerns, right? Because how do you choose the 3 most important? And it is complicated, and we are going to miss a lot of nuance with this method. It is crude, but our main goals are to make it efficient and still be able to tell something that gives a sense at least of what instructors are trying to do.
I'm sorry, but could you put that in context? I mean, when you're talking about kind of issue in the like questionnaire and what have you, are you talking about a forum with a lot of people, or are you talking about giving people in some groups some? I wasn't here from the beginning, so I'm missing something here. I'm sorry.
Okay. So just a general thing of what the survey was. Good question. So it was a fairly brief survey that just asked instructors to first tell us what materials they use in their class, so that could be empirical readings, philosophical readings, what activities they use in their class, so that could be lectures or discussions, and then what sorts of thinking these activities and methods are supposed to cultivate, and then goals. So the idea is it's a survey that's intended to help us build a model that represents the logic underlying a given course. We want it to be something that took less than 10 minutes to complete.
I have a question for the audience. Can I ask a question to you guys first? It's okay? I'm interested to hear from you what you want to know about the teaching of learning of ethics on campus that we're not addressing yet. Anybody?
Well, this is not so much at all that you're not addressing. I think this is so interesting for all of us who want to know. But when there, in the long run, when there may be some statement with respect to the rest of the world, what's going on about ethics at one university or a number of universities, and I'm thinking, for instance, of a column by David Brooks that I really disagreed with, where he said, it's amazing, American universities, they can teach everything. They can teach mathematics, they can teach science, but they can't teach people to be better human beings. Which essentially, if he's saying they can't teach ethics at all, he's so wrong. But how would you answer somebody like that? And a lot of people, as we now know, are very suspicious of universities, in particular that something may be going wrong from the point of view of ethics. And so you are doing this, which is so important, but whether in the long run there will be some conclusion with respect to either a university or quite a few about the teaching of ethics and how much, for example, and even a small question, what proportion of students actually encounter a course at all? I don't know if that's going to.
That would have the second question about the proportion of students encounter a question at all, a course at all, would have to be determined, I think, in a school-by-school basis. But there, most of the professional schools here anyway do have a requirement. The college does have a requirement. So I think at Harvard, most students do encounter ethics courses, and I think that's the first point, right? Do they have the opportunity? And then the next question is that opportunity effective? And then, a point that Brian brought up in his presentation is, how are we going to think about effective curriculum design? Because we all also know that encountering one time in one course, right, I think most people believe is not enough, right? And so Ronnie's presentation is talking about, embedding ethics in different locations and getting people more comfortable with the idea of teaching the ethical dimensions, no matter what your discipline, no matter where students will encounter this. And I think that, I'm hoping that there is more research driving that direction. There's another ethics boom going on in terms of institutions offering ethics education, an increase in ethics across the curriculum programming at institutions around the country. These are some of the things that we're looking into in our kind of large scale approach. And I do think, I think that a lot of people take that as a separate question from, can this help students become better people, the David Brooks question. And I think actually one of the things that motivates our study is the fact that a lot of places doing assessment in ethics right now have defaulted to looking only at the critical thinking skills and the ethical reasoning skills established because it's too difficult to assess other kinds of development. And so, in a sense, we're pushing it back against that to say that human development happens in a variety of ways, and that kind of, that ethics courses are doing more than just teaching critical thinking skills. And I think you pointed to this too, Ronnie, in your presentation, sort of range up and down the human body of all of the things that are happening. So I think the first point to address David Brooks and the critics of that sort is the descriptive answer. It is to say we don't understand well all of the things that are happening in ethics courses, and if we can better articulate that, if people have a better understanding of all of the different and complex learning that's happening when students are taking courses that are focusing on ethics, then I think that they might think a little differently about what's happening on the campuses, and I don't think they would find it objectionable, because as you've pointed out long ago too, there was a fear of indoctrination, which I think is the same fear we're facing now, that this kind of teaching could be seen as indoctrinating. But when we clearly articulate the learning goals as instructors are telling us about that, that's not the goal at all. It's to engage multiple perspectives. It's to make space in controversy for different sides of issues to be aired. It's to be able to evaluate the positions of multiple stakeholders. So I kind of hope that if we can get some more data and broadly, and we will probably get different flavors of what's happening at a place like Harvard from some small schools through the national study, I kind of hope that when we can write that up, then we will be able to show just how diverse the learning is in ethics courses, and hopefully defend that a bit against the critics. And it's also a defense of the liberal arts and humanities, frankly, because right now there's such a pressure for education to lead directly to jobs, right? And so, what we're showing is you put the vocational piece in there, it is important, but it's not all that education tries to do, right? And if we lose sight of what the civic goals are and the existential goals are in terms of development, then we have a lot of problems, right? So that would be the hope. Unfortunately, it's hard to move as fast as we would like to move with this process, right? So, but this is the direction we're going in, and I appreciate those questions.
Well, and I think that the essence of what you're also saying is you would never want to quote unquote make students. You would never want to make students more moral in some way. You want to offer them the opportunity to think through all these things, the perspectives, etc.,
Right.
and to learn in that sense. Yes.
I think Alex, sorry, I did cut off Alex.
That's okay, go ahead and then I can come right to
So I had another response to your question about what is it that I want to know that this isn't currently answering. So I really appreciate the way that the kind of humility of your approach that treats the teachers as the experts in what ethics instruction is and can be. There's a kind of gap that I imagine might exist, but I don't know whether your current methodology enables you to see or not, which is, suppose that I'm an ethics instructor, and I think one thing that students really need is, let's just say it's like something like the ability to stand up to authority figures. And that's part of that's part of something that they need in their ethics education. But I have no idea how to give them that. So my class doesn't currently ask them to do that or offer them opportunities to improve in that skill. But I, as an expert, I do think that it's part of what they need ethically to develop. So it seems like if I understand right, your current methodology would invite me to say what my classes actually do, but wouldn't give me an opportunity to let you know that there's something I'm not doing and that I can see that I need to do, but I don't know how to do. And I also think, like, you may have that instructor, and then you also may have the instructor with a little bit less self-knowledge who just says, like, well, I was never taught that in my ethics class, and I don't know if it's the place of an ethics instructor to teach something like that. So that may be like a different kind of version of that gap. I don't know whether, like, I think the first version of that is more consistent with the humility with which your project addresses instructors than the second one that says, like, well, you might not even realize that there's a part of ethics instruction that you're missing. But the first one, it seemed like that may be part of the instructor's knowledge base that this questionnaire wouldn't access.
Take a stab and then
Yeah.
let David follow. It's really interesting that you say that because I think what you're suggesting to us is we actually might need to integrate a little bit more on our instructor side what Stanford is doing on the student side, and we have been working at project integration. So for instance, you know, we're including reaching out to the students to understand the alignment based on what instructors are thinking. The way the project was kind of divided up originally was that we were going to be taking a more historical and descriptive approach to try to understand what is happening and what is going on in courses now rather than what ought to be, and that there needs to be a space in the project to also address that prescriptive part, right? So descriptive, but then also what ought to be happening and what is not happening. And instructors probably do have a lot of ideas about this too and some sensibilities. And so far we've only been approaching that through the work at Stanford with the students. But maybe what we need to do is get Stanford to take up the student and instructor to do some of that work for us, or to modify what we're doing to think about that too. So I think that's a really great point. I think we have been kind of more narrowly focused on just trying to get a handle on what's happening in the classrooms now.
I hope that what I say builds exactly on the previous few comments. So something that I'd welcome more of that I think addresses the gap potentially would be to, and it was a question that I had before you even asked your question, to what extent are you considering following up with individual interviews or focus groups? Because I'd welcome profiles of promising practices or stories or instances where a student felt that the way the faculty used X activity with Z material helped to cultivate this thing in a particularly powerful way. And that then starts to build a bank of ideas for the person who thinks that, you know, achievement Z is important, but I have no idea how. So, and in the interviews or the focus groups, part of the question could be, you've said you do this thing, why do you do this thing? And by doing that, and then asking the students, how is that thing done especially well? Compiling those stories or those promising practices could, and it would be great to have them broken out by either, you know, all domains or by the subdomains, so that people could sort of self-select into looking at those accordingly.
Sure. That is our grand vision, is that somebody could look at this as basically a map and say, oh, I'm looking to get my students to analyze and understand problems on a macro level, but maybe I don't really feel confident that I have the skills to do that. Ideal if we, you know, we would be able to say, well, here's sort of a library of people you should contact because their students say they're doing it, they say they're doing it. Here are the different ways they go about achieving it. So the idea really is that this should facilitate sharing of information. That's another reason to be very careful about not being evaluative too much and really just be descriptive, so that there can be sort of communities of practice that build up.
I'll add that we did do focus groups with some faculty following the first couple rounds of our surveying, in part because we wanted to hear a little bit more. And it was pretty interesting, but it kind of happened more in the space of people were really excited to find that there were other people who really care about teaching ethics on the campus. And so, you know, I think there's an interest in having these kinds of professional development groups or practitioner groups kind of forming in response to some of this. So I think that there's a space for that, and that is a really great opportunity. The two things that kind of push against that or make it harder for us, one is that, you know, we promise anonymity through the survey, so we have to have people kind of identify if they want to be, you know, known and to what degree they'll even talk with us as opposed to just stay anonymous. And so that makes it tricky. The other one is that we started this out with the idea of moving out towards scale. So we've been balancing just trying to figure out how to do this here, and there's a lot of promise in terms of how it could help with, you know, communities where people want to be all, you know, visible to each other and working together. And that's one, I think, strand of the project. And then the other is figuring out how can we create some tools that we can export and that can gather data for us really, really broadly, where we're just not going to have that kind of an opportunity to follow up. And so, but we're hoping, you know, what we can do is put those tools in the hands of people who want to do that on their own campuses, and that they'll give us access to their data for secondary use, so we can still analyze what's coming in. I think we'll continue to try to figure out how to kind of strike that balance.
So I was wondering what, if anything, is distinctive about the teaching practices of people who are in what were identified as like more core ethics classes as opposed to the more peripheral ones, if there are any trends depending on that.
I haven't put together that yet. Thought we covered every possible permutation. No, I do. I mean, we have looked at like differences between FAS and other schools. The color coding here is completely different, so that's why this didn't make it in the main presentation. But we have tried to start to see, you know, can we look at, is there sort of a trend here that's happening that's not happening somewhere else? We don't have enough data to say much about it. It's more to sort of see, theoretically, could we break down a larger data set in these ways? And to your point, absolutely. I mean, one thing that would be really nice to do with a larger sample is, rather than just doing raw counts, of being able to actually do some multi-level modeling or even correlations to see, you know, what forms of cultivation are actually most strongly associated with different achievement goals. We just don't have the data to do that right now, but we would like to be able to do that. And then we could see things like, you know, depending on the percentage of the course that deals with ethics according to the instructor, that was one question we asked them, you know, are they more or less likely to gravitate towards some of these goals, right? And that might tell us like which are the sort of goals that come up in core ethics courses versus goals that come up in like, you know, a course that maybe has like a week or a day on, you know, the professional ethics of some issue.
This is a really basic logistical question about your method, but suppose you have a course that does have just a week or a day on some ethical issue, and outside of that week or that day, they do some guest speakers on a different issue. Would guest speakers, if guest speakers are really dominant in that course, would that come up here, or is it limited to the ethics content in that course?
That's a great question. So we did ask instructors to focus on their teaching of ethics in the course, and we also asked students to focus on their learning of ethics. That's also really hard though, because even if you ask a student, okay, now think about how much of the course dealt with ethics, and actually the range from courses vary quite a bit, so there'd be like one person who said like 8%, and one person said 60%, and it's hard to sort of say one is wrong or right. So then you really do start just looking at like averages and hope that they are representative. But I think that we can't be completely sure. Like, it's just so hard to get people to limit their introspection to that degree. We did ask them though to think primarily about their learning around ethics. So yeah, it might have been that they had a philosopher come in. that one day.
I'm not sure, whoops, I was just gonna say, I'm not, I was just gonna add quickly that I'm not sure that courses where it wasn't a big component, I mean, just given the way we identified the courses through the course description analysis to begin with, I'm not sure that courses where it wasn't, you know, kind of at least a decent amount going on there would have made it into our pool, so.
I had just another kind of basic logistical question. For the domains of human development, was only one able to be identified for each course?
So yes, we did ask instructors to choose the one that they think is best and then any others, and many people did select more than one. So again, there's a lot more nuance in the data that we're just not getting into right now. But yes, it is often the case that people pursue more than one, but they do typically sort of say this is the.
And the other thing, and this is Jess, your question about like what are you interested in? I was thinking in the slides that you had that were sort of focused on a single course. I was thinking about the ways that we're thinking of like teaching as a craft. When you sort of see the divergence that could happen as you sort of move along towards cultivation and achievement, how much of that might be as a teacher is learning what they're doing. And so the ways that those things can kind of come apart when like the intentions and the impacts essentially start to diverge. And that like as you're becoming like a better teacher, you might have more skills of making your goals explicit, and you might also just develop more skill in actually like coming up with the right kinds of materials and activities to support those like learning goals. So just as a sort of like lens for interpreting, I was curious to see like what would that look like over time to sort of follow a course for a little bit and see that trajectory, and if there does start to be more alignment, especially if it coincided with certain kinds of support.
That's a great point. One of the things that we're talking about with the program in general education is the use of this sort of tool for the new ethics and civics courses. And so, imagining that right from the outset, as they launch the program, when the instructors teach the courses in that program, then they can do this, they can get their students to participate in it, and then next time go again, and we could actually track if there's any kind of change over time, and to get more information and feedback from the instructor in that space about, okay, I really was trying to achieve this. My students didn't really respond there, or didn't see me achieving that. And then we could focus on that and say if that's the area for improvement that they would want to kind of tackle. So yeah, I think that's certainly I think in there as a use for this tool. Sorry.
Yes, well, I just have to tell you that I really love the interaction between, especially the lady here with that question. It's really, really powerful question about humanity, you don't make a human being kind of thing. And I got the word you came out with is imagine, John Lennon, imagine, there's no heaven, And I wonder if there is some type of a duty to ethic workers, ethic people, ethic teachers to try to get across some type of program that would fight artificial intelligence these days, that is really coming out with all of the things that are really going to be accomplished by that, to balance humanity back, because I think we need each other. We really need to survive as humanity. We need each other to really bring up the ethics and become more humans. So I'm imagining the type of things that need to happen in the schoolrooms or what have you in the community to get this type of things, and ethics seems to have the roadmap to accomplish that. Anyways, imagine.
Yeah, thank you.
Kind of on that point, Jess, and I want you to say more about this, but imagine I'm asking this as a very easy question. Let's say I don't think that ethics is learned didactically. It doesn't happen in the classroom at all. So a lot of what you presented won't say very much about how ethics is actually taught and learned, because we think in this kind of collegiate experience of living on campus, doing a bunch of other extracurricular activities, that ethics is learned outside of the classroom. for the most part. Can you say a little bit more about the National Ethics Project and how you're approaching that?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of interest in looking at this development more holistically, and so one of the goals of the project was to try to identify the spaces all over campus, both in classroom and outside of classroom, where ethics learning is taking place. And really the Stanford project was trying to take the lead there on trying to find the places and the moments where it's most salient to students, so that from that learning side, they are identifying that. And they're, you know, it's an important part and complement to what we're up to, because you know, one of the things that they're finding is that the students aren't really identifying what's going on in their classrooms there as necessarily, at least the ones they've talked to. Now, again, it's a limited sample, it's a very labor-intensive ethnographic approach, but from their limited sample, the students aren't really identifying what they're doing in class as directly relevant to the problems that they face necessarily. So that's opening up a space for, you know, potentially coming up with new programs around campus in the co-curricular space that would be better designed to address those needs. And it's also going to, I think, open up some space for possible changes to what we need to be doing in the classroom too. So again, our purpose in holding the line on being descriptive, hopefully, is to not get ahead of ourselves and first to say, here is what's happening as best as we can understand, and taking it, you know, in the best interpretive way we can, being generous about the work that's going on. Here's what people are saying, the students are saying is not happening, that needs to be happening. And then what does that mean now for making some kind of recommendations forward looking?
Another thing I would be curious about is whether alums, and I don't know if there's logistically nightmares, like sort of I'm looking at this and I'm imagining like, okay, well maybe my students right after my class and say that class was BS and I learned nothing. And then maybe like a decade later they're thinking, like going to sleep at night and going, thank God I took Rodi's class, I think I learned stuff. So like, is there a way of finding out whether alums think that the things that they did in college were valuable, and whether that diverges from what current students think?
I think there are a lot of,
Yeah.
I think there are a lot of different projects that are interested in getting at that. And my hope is that somebody else is collecting that data for us, because it's just so difficult already to try to collect the data that we're trying to collect, and it's full of challenges. So I think for now we're going to, even recognizing limitations of just trying to go broadly instructional, student, and institutional perspectives for a project, at least that might give us some composite pictures if we can put this together and make it possible for institutions to do these sort of, you know, evaluations for their schools. Here's what it looks like, you know, broadly for what you're advertising to the campus of what you're doing. Here's your student experience of that, and here's what's going on instructionally. It would be a step forward. I'm not saying it's going to answer all the questions. Would love to hear from all the alumni. Have you ever taken an alumni survey from your college? Nope. Neither have I.
I will add, Harvard does have almost an 80-year study on success, what people deem as success and what they've learned and taken away from Harvard. It's all men from the 1930s or 40s, or 40s, it gotta be. But it's something to look at.
Okay. Oh, well, if there's any other questions, we're happy to answer them. But if not, we're also, you know, we were excited by the idea of letting you guys out early. So we're happy to do that too. So happy to talk. We're happy to let you go.
Thank you, Jess. All right, well, you've done it. All of you, the few in the crowd that have been here with us, some of you since Tuesday, so I thank you very much for being with us for multiple days. What have we done here? We've really started with an overview of what the Ethics Pedagogy Initiative is. Dr. Robichaud led us into kind of rationale for what innovating in this space looks like, led us into active learning activities, and then really we had 4 very distinct presentations on interventions from our fellows, and they brought to bear their expertise on different ways of thinking about innovating in a pedagogical space in educational ethics. And then we wrapped it up with really a really full picture of what this looks like and could look like, and what the future looks like in ethics education on Harvard's campus. So thank you so much. What's next? We really hope to continue to be able to collaborate with HILT, Project Zero, the Bach Center, et cetera, for future consultations and developing a really robust and curriculum and pedagogy and a pedagogical approach for teaching and learning of ethics around campus now and into the future. So thank you so much. If you have been here or if you have not been here the entire time, it doesn't matter to me much, but I have some feedback, and we have a little bit of time. Obviously you can still leave early, but I have some feedback, paper feedback forms, which nothing can go wrong with, technologically speaking. But if you could fill these out, obviously you don't have to, but if you could take a second to fill out some of these feedback forms, that would be greatly appreciated by us. And again, thank you so much. Yes, there's some right there.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.